Well, to think through what the biggest challenges are, it's hard because we're talking about such different urban conditions in different parts of the world. So, of course, for Europe and for big parts of North America, a major challenge is depopulation. It's a decrease of the productive part of the labor force and shrinking cities and how you cope with that. And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum the extreme of African cities where you will have really dramatic fertility rates still and a massive increase in the urban population. In fact, the UN says we're going to see a trebling of the urban population for Africa from about 430 million to 1.2 billion people by 2050. And that is in a context where, with the changes in technology, the global economy, the new centers of power within the global economy, Africa is completely marginalized. And most of the young people that will come into the labor force and that will grow up in cities, not necessarily migrate to cities, but grow up in cities, be born there, have very little by way of prospects. And so the biggest challenge by far is what one could possibly frame as cultural inclusion into the 21st century. What does that mean? Who's going to deliver that, and how do we create institutional frameworks and new economic patterns that will address that problem? So when we reflect on informal settlements, again, this is such a lumpy concept, and you're dealing with such extreme variation in different parts of the world. And so the nature of informality in Latin America, the sort of built form of it is very different to most shanty towns in Africa. And again, of course, in the tropical climates of Asia, you have different issues. So we've got to be careful. We've got to think in a very disaggregated way about this. We also have to be careful whether we're talking about incorporating informal settlements into the city. Informal settlements are the city in most places. So the question really is, how do you incorporate the aspirations and the demands and the drivers of consumption of the middle classes and the elites that constitute a small part of the city into the life of the informal settlement, right? So if we turn that question on its head, you come up with a very different way of thinking about it. In other words, you begin to recognize that these are cities in and of themselves. They've got their own logics, they've got their own systems within which they reproduce themselves. It's not always, of course, conducive for good public health or conducive for safety or security, but there are worlds there in these places, and we have to understand them before we can deal with questions of incorporation. That said, of course, we have to find much more productive ways of dealing with the basics: education, health, decent shelter, access to the commons, access to public space, the opportunities to make a living without the fear of extortion and so forth. And this requires thought, and it requires engagement with communities, and it requires understanding the current practices and how you can enhance that through the agency and the institutions of the people who live there. But very importantly, it requires a redistribution of the overall resource envelope of the city at large, the larger city region, the national fiscus, so that we reorder the priorities and we don't foreground or we don't prioritize the needs of elite investments, airports, major highways, shopping malls, and so forth, but we make those secondary to addressing these fundamentals about quality of life and opportunity for people who live in informal settlements. So fundamentally, I think it boils down to a radical reformulation of planning frameworks, governance systems, creating the resources to support the institutions of people who live in these communities to have greater autonomy in shaping how they want to evolve and develop their communities, and making sure that the research and development and technology agendas reinforces that agenda. So I think appropriate technology, affordable technology, universal access to new ICT opportunities is absolutely crucial to enable this transition. I'm very skeptical at the moment. I don't have such hope. I think that it is completely captured by the vested interest of the nation-state United Nations horse trading process. We've got a global political crisis in democracy, right? It's at all levels of society, global, national, local. If you look at the rise of populism, if you look at the rise of extremism, the rise of xenophobia, increasing racism, we've got a political crisis and no one is admitting it. So the idea that the institutions at the core of the political crisis are somehow able to overcome their own limitations and lack of vision and guts and produce a document that is really going to catalyze a revolution is ridiculous. I mean, what basis for that confidence could we have? So no, I think that the crisis will get deeper and we'll have more citizens' movements rising up. We'll have new enlightened business interests to understand the importance of a new paradigm, a new economic system that will support that movement, and politicians will catch up at some point.